Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. My name is Olev and thank you all for being here. Wow, I can see it's a very big crowd this time, more than usual. I understand that there's a lot of talk about Steam, about what's going on today. Hi there, Anti-Comic Blood and Rondon. Wow. So yes, I would suggest to anyone who's interested, we can take the next hour to sort of take a break and put all the Steam-related things aside just for the moment. There's a lot that's been going on. I personally am no expert about the subject, so I really can't be here talking about it. I'm learning as much as I can and listening and reading to all the people who are talking about it. But for the next hour, I'll be focusing on something that I'm a little bit more knowledgeable. Exactly, decompress, exactly. So it's funny actually, for those who've been listening to the podcast from the beginning, I thought that in the earlier episodes I already spoke about one of the real cornerstones about the ecoVillage. And when I went through it again, I realized that I hadn't actually talked about it here. I have a live stream that I do on the on my YouTube channel, on our family's YouTube channel, and I haven't actually mentioned it here. So that's what I want to talk about this episode, and I'll give a brief, very brief overview for those who have already heard me talk about it or seen something about it. I don't want to go into too much of an introduction. And then this episode, I'm going to focus on the first method. And so behind the ecoVillage model and the different applications and ways that we have of basically doing what we need to do to create it, there are 5 general methodologies, the 5 different methods that are 5 pillars of the ecoVillage and strategies and how to implement these things. And so I'm going to go through the names of these methods. Some of them may be more known than others, but over the next few episodes I want to actually go into each of these more in depth. And so the 5 methods are permaculture, food forests, earth chips. And if anyone knows about Alex, who lives in an earthship, he's a very big advocate, and I'm assuming that a lot of the people in the steamer community have heard about it through him. The next one is called natural farming, and it was invented by Masanobu Fukuoka, who was a Japanese farmer. For those who might have heard his name, or he wrote a very famous book called The One Straw Revolution. And the final method is keyline farming, which I've spoken about a few times before. I think I mentioned it on Pensif's podcast as well. But those are the 5 different methods. Oh, hi there, Steam It QA and Atomic Swoop. I'm going to be going through the chat throughout the show, but I might miss a few things along the way, so I apologize if it takes me a while to respond. But the different methodologies and the different methods are each very, very robust, and people spend their whole lives just studying one method. And I'm certainly not going to offer any kind of expert insight into any of these. But for anyone who hasn't heard of one of them, and also since they're so robust, I'd like to really try and show some of the thinking behind it that will be able to carry over into different areas of our lives. If you haven't noticed until now, I'm very much about the connection between things and the ability to learn, sort of to identify patterns and to learn from one case and apply it to another. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about permaculture. And within permaculture, obviously, it's a huge subject that many different people have also taken it each to their own personal place. But one of the original authors, inventors of permaculture was David Holmgren. And he really focused a lot on the written theory behind permaculture. And one of the things that he brought were these 12 principles. If you haven't heard of them before, there are these 12 basic principles that whenever you work within permaculture, you want to have them in mind and to sort of strategize with them. And so I've chosen 3 of these principles that I'd like to talk about in this episode. And we'll see how it goes. We'll see what we get into. Yeah, you have the original book. Yeah, I read his, I don't have it, I borrowed it from a friend. But if you haven't read David Holmgren's, I can't remember what it's called. I think Permaculture Design. I can't remember the exact name of the book, but it's a very interesting read and it's very good. I mean, Bill Mollison and a lot of what's taught today is a lot of practice, which is obviously very important and really hands-on design. How do you do? But David Holmgren really gives a very good insight into the thinking behind and the real change in the paradigm shift that we can hope to expect from working with permaculture. And so of these 12 principles, the 3 that I've chosen to speak about today are, the first is design from patterns to details. The second is use small, slow solutions. And the third is apply self-regulation and feedback. And so I think each of these are rather easy to sort of understand, each in our own way. They're fairly straightforward. And so I'd like to talk about them in a little bit of a more philosophical way, maybe. So the first one is designs from patterns to details. Now, patterns and details are 2 sort of words, names that we can use, and we can change them with a lot of different other names like micro and macro. Micro obviously being the details and macro being the larger patterns. We can see them as 2 sort of opposites, the foreground and the background, the subject and the surroundings. And when we think about designing from patterns to details, this is a certain linear line that's drawn between, obviously, the larger, grander, more interconnected patterns, all the way down to the specific nitty-gritty details that we get into. And so to talk about this metaphor, I want to talk about something that I've mentioned, I think, once before on the show, and that is the game of Go. In Japanese, the name Go, in Chinese, Wei Qi, and Korean, Baduk. And for those who've never heard of it, I won't go into too much detail about what it is because it's not important, but it's basically a game, a strategy game between 2 players. A lot of people liken it or compare it to chess, though it's very, very different. But it is a game where 2 opponents play, each one plays 1 move in their turn. And the object of the game is to surround territory and to make more territory than the opponent. So, yes, I mean, okay, I'll be honest with you. For me personally, I discovered Go, I think I mentioned as well, so I'll be brief, but I discovered Go while I was traveling in India with my then girlfriend, and we played it together. We started getting into it, and it really did change my life. It's become part of my spiritual practice and sort of psychological cleansing. It's a game which is so open and free that the choices that you make and the way that you play really show your state of mind and your psychology. And if you happen to have imperfections, as I most certainly do, then they will often show up in your game. And if you're humble enough and willing to learn from your mistakes, then you can actually, I believe, and I've experienced, improve myself psychologically, my behavior, change habits, or become more aware of things by playing. So I'm a very, very big advocate of the game, but in relation to what we're talking about, there's a lot of different things that I think Go simulates life very well and allows us to sort of examine different parts of life through the game. And one of the things that it does very well is the distinction between micro and macro, between patterns and details. And so the game itself goes on a very large board of a grid of 19 by 19, 361 points where you can play in total. And so as the game develops, there's always this shift between a certain sort of battle that takes place in one area of the board, and as that develops, there's a certain give and take, and people, each side gains something and loses something. And when that battle finishes, you move on to another area of the board, and then there's a battle over there. And as this is all going on, it's very easy in the beginning to get sucked into the details, to get sucked into focusing on the micro and really only thinking about the situation specifically and locally. And what happens very often on lower level players is that as you're winning these battles and you're going around and getting successful results everywhere, you're missing the larger picture. And by the end of the game, if you're against a stronger opponent who's good enough, before you can actually realize what's going on and turn around, the game has actually already been won. The war, as it were, is over. And even though all of those small battles were won and you managed to get more points in each place, lacking that oversight of seeing how this affects the rest of the board, how this affects the rest of the sort of war, leads to a very unexpected defeat. And so I just bring it up because it's a very interesting subject for those who've never heard of it. I would recommend looking into it. But it's very much the same in life, I feel. And I think there's definitely this balancing act where at times you need to focus more on the details and at times you need to focus more on the patterns. And I think different people have a different balance within them. And so I certainly am much more inclined towards patterns than details. I have a much harder time focusing and being interested in sort of getting the exact details. And I'm much more in, very global pattern-like terms. And so I think we each have obviously our work that we have to do within ourselves to be able to see both sides. And the best option is to be able to see both sides at the same time. But in life in general, I think there are many times when we can get sucked in to the local things and be focused on what's happening in the immediate time or the immediate surroundings. And often when this happens, we can actually fall into this trap of not noticing sort of larger things that are going on, but going on in very small parts. I mean, this is a phenomenon that we can see happening in many different instances, I think, but one of the clear cases is indeed, as Pendra says, in global patterns. When you look at changes that are coming, usually larger changes, they don't happen all at once. They may seem to happen all at once to us because often when that's the case, we haven't noticed the signs before. But once that does, the change happens, then it's very, very obvious. So I think that there's a very important skill that can be developed. And it's that skill that it's sort of talked about in the permaculture principle, that before you get too engrossed with the details, before you get too caught up with the, matter of fact and immediate attention and details, there's always this very, very large picture that's going on. And that large picture is not going to be made up in the same way. And it's not going to be so easily seen because its signs and its, the signs of patterns are very much, much more obscure and much more subtle. And so I think when we come, whether it's to design a homestead, a farm, or whether it's to start any kind of project, or even, in our case, whether it's dealing with a blockchain going through some kind of changes, as we've seen, it's always good to be able to not just focus on the immediate and, what plants I want to put, or what actions I need to do right now, but also seeing in the long run, how is this going to develop over the next few years, and what kind of patterns can I see from studying what's happened so far and being able to project into the future that can help me guide the choices that I want to make about the details. And so it's obviously this balance between the two. It's obviously one is always aiding to see the other, but specifically in the permaculture principle, David Holmgren chooses to talk about designing from patterns to details and not the other way around. And I think that is important, that there is a certain, it's easier. If you get too engrossed in the details, it'll be much harder for you to see the general pattern. Whereas once you can identify the actual pattern of what's going on, once you can see beyond the symptoms of something to a larger thing that's happening, a larger thing that's in play, it'll be much easier to identify the details, see what needs changing, see what you need to do to deal with it, etc., etc. And so I thought that's an interesting point. I'd be happy. Oh, sorry, I can see in chat. Yeah. Oh, we have another Go player, 3Dan. Wow. Mark. Sorry, I hope I'm not mispronouncing this. Marco Jantunen. Thank you very much for joining. It's good to meet fellow Go players always. I was actually thinking, following the community update, to start a Go community. So if anyone in the chat after the show or during the show is interested in learning or would like me to upload some sort of basic instructional videos about how to play the game, let me know, because I've been thinking about doing that, and I don't know if there's any requests for it. But I'll leave that for now. So the first principle of designing from patterns to details is basically looking at the general structures and seeing how we can learn from them what we need to do in the detail level. The next permaculture design principle that I was talking about is use small, slow solutions. Now, this is a very, well, for me, it's a very, very important lesson. It's actually a lesson that I'm learning right now with our work here in Portugal, with our work with a project. I don't know why. I guess maybe our generation more than others, but there seems to be a great need for people to urgently get things done. We seem to have very little patience left. I don't think this is everyone or everywhere, and certainly there are a lot of people that recognize the problem with that and try to change it. But generally speaking, in our society today, I think that we feel very much inclined to see results as quickly as possible, and not seeing results or even sort of failing at the beginning is often considered a waste of time and something that we need to like give up on. Now, in our time here in Portugal, which hasn't been very long, I have to say, but we've met quite a few people living on farms, living in homesteads, and working on the land. And there seems to be a general difficulty that many people have faced here that was rather surprising for me. And that is that when people buy their land in Portugal, they're very, very impatient about getting onto the land and living there as quickly as possible, which obviously I understand as someone who's been waiting for years, literally, years to get to the land and actually be living on it. It's very, very frustrating to be living in these concrete walls and all the electricity around, etc. But having said that, all of the people that I spoke to who moved onto the land very quickly described how difficult it was to then actually work on the land because there weren't any facilities yet. So, for example, if they had to get their water, they'd go and drive and fill up the bottles and have to do that every day. And getting food ready was much harder, so there was a lot of work and preparation in that. And so because once you move out onto the land before there is anything there really, a lot of your work becomes around survival and being able to actually live the day-to-day there. And the idea for us from the beginning, long before we got here, was we're going to buy the land, and we're going to be having the land and waiting with it for quite a long time. Not working in the beginning because we bought it before we actually moved here. And even once we'd moved here, since we had a little baby and it was winter, we knew we were going to be staying in the house for most of the beginning. And this is very frustrating and very difficult, obviously. I mean, every day I can't tell you how much I'm waiting to be able to go and sleep our first night on the land. But this permaculture principle is a lesson that I'm going through these very days, where we've actually started we've ordered a teepee, and we're going to be working on setting it up. And so I started working, and during my work I was very eager to get it done basically as quickly as possible and get as much done as possible, and felt this real urgency since it was actually happening and we're finally doing it. And I actually ended up hurting my foot. I stepped on a very sharp piece of wood, and it went right through my shoe, and it actually pierced my skin a bit, but the real trauma was to I think it's the bone or the ligament. I didn't tear or break anything, but I wasn't really able to walk on my foot for a good few days. And during that time, when I was resting in bed with my foot up, feeling very sorry for myself, and wondering how, so expectant to get on the land and start working, and so excited that it's finally happening, and in the end now I'm lying in bed, can't do anything. It really made me think of this principle: use small and slow solutions. And these small and slow solutions are two very key words. It's very hard for me, since I think in patterns and think very globally and largely. I always imagine the holistic end result system and everything interconnected and it all functioning together. And that's, the weakness of that side is that I can sometimes be either impatient or think too largely about the subject. And so when we talk about this, use small and slow solutions, I think the real lesson here is to not be too quick with our judgment, with our decision making, to really take our time before we want to jump into action, before we want to get hot-headed or start doing things that later we might find there could have been a better solution for. For me personally, this is a very difficult thing to learn, but I know that the best way to do something, the best way to start, especially a large, complex project, is to do it bit by bit and slowly progress as things show themselves to be working or not working, and to really be as patient as possible about the whole process. Now, I know that, sometimes it can be very hard to see the balance. Very often we can sort of procrastinate, get into just designing and just thinking about and just doing the theory without ever getting to the practice of actually doing something. And certainly without doing it practically, it's very hard to learn and to see what kind of progress you're making. But nevertheless, I think that there is a very important balance to strike between people being too gung-ho, people acting too quickly, and then later on, as I've seen on many, many farms, you have to go and fix problems that were done, things that were done that weren't thought out, or that they didn't consider something new that can happen. And I hate to say it, but I think it does relate as well to the steamer situation now, where this is something that's happened rather suddenly, and obviously it needs to be dealt with, and I'm not going to suggest any kind of solutions. But whenever we're thinking about the blockchain, and this whole very, very large, complex concept of a community online, working together independently, it's very good to have these very slow solutions that can be dealt with problems that arise during the time, and have them implemented over time, and being able to really check our progress and see what's happening, what we thought versus the reality, and how is this affecting. I think the concept of decentralization is a very difficult concept to manage, because as soon as you're managing it, you are in a way, to a certain degree, you're trying to implement a will on this sort of decentralized thing. And so whenever these kind of things are happening, this is the same with the eco-village. When you get to designing a space, designing a living social situation where many different people can come together, and you want to prevent any problems between people, you want to prevent bullying of any kind, you want to allow people self-expression, all of these different things. I think it's very, very important that you really start it slowly, start it as a long transition period, whereby, you know, in the beginning it's not actually everyone living in the same house. I mean, obviously not in the end as well, but in the beginning you sort of maybe meet up and, you know, see the people and stay a few days together and take it as slowly as necessary in order to allow it to be as solid and as stable as possible. So this is a very difficult concept for me to learn, and I'm certainly slowly taking my time, but managing to let it sink in, that even if I feel that something is happening that I have to respond to, or that I've missed, you know, that I'm behind schedule, that I should have gotten something done that I didn't, it's always very important to take a deep breath and remember that everything happens when it's supposed to happen, you know. So I think there's a lot that we can learn about this. Now, this sort of leads into the next principle, because if we accept that this is a slow solution that happens over time, what we're really talking about is sort of this next principle: applying self-regulation and feedback. And so there is this acceptance. When I have an idea, let's say, you know, the eco-village model, I have this vision in my head, and now all that's left is to implement it and we'll be done. This concept of the eco-village is an idea from really the Greek origin of the word, an ideal, which is something that's not real, something that is in my mind, something that is theoretical rather than actual and in existence. And so when we start with this concept, this ideal thing, it can be perfect in a way that only an idea can be perfect. And once we're going to implement it in reality, all of these different things are going to come up, certain problems and certain just new innovations that you hadn't predicted before can show themselves. And so when we think about applying a slow solution over time, what we're actually accepting is that the idea that we have isn't perfect at the moment. And in fact, as we know, nothing is perfect when it comes out. And even though we sort of know this on a very basic level, when it actually comes down to it, we very often forget. We very often think that what I have here is something that is, because it's good now, because it's working, I can be very, very afraid of changing it, or I can criticize anyone who wants to change it, or you can think that they can improve on it. And being too attached to an idea can be very, very dangerous. And that's why with this principle of slow solutions and self-regulation, looking for that feedback, trying to improve, we're constantly trying to make the better version of what we started out with. Because whenever we have an idea that we're putting forward, it's always going to be lacking in a certain way, or can be improved in a certain way. Certainly over time, and as the idea expands and grows and changes. And so a friend of mine that I was driving with today said to me at one point that change is the only constant. And I really like that tagline, because it's obviously paradoxical, you know, change is the opposite of constants. But it's true that when we look around us, we're in this constant duality between seeing things as constant, as stable, as orderly, as consistent, And yet within ourselves we do realize and recognize that things are changing because we see change happening all the time. And so I think it's a very interesting dual perspective to have. Obviously, any kind of end of the spectrum where you're exaggerating is not going to be good. But when we think about consistency and change, these are two polar opposites that seem to be dancing constantly in this reality that we're in. And I think change can be very, very scary, and certainly we can think of examples of change in the world today, not only our personal lives, where things that we didn't, expect or see coming that suddenly crop up, the coronavirus, the deal with Steemit, even the community idea seemed to really take hold and change a lot of things. And these changes, as we say, they sort of keep on coming. I don't know about you personally, but everyone I've spoken to lately seems to be going through a very, very intense period in time. I'm sure you all have your shit you're dealing with. For me personally, it's been a very intense week, and it's flown by on the one hand, but a lot has happened in the other. And a lot of it is changes that are coming up. And really, these changes and what I'm facing are forcing me to change in response to them. And I don't, I think of myself as someone who is very willing to change. And I think that, on average, maybe relatively, I'm not as attached. But being here now and seeing these things, facing these challenges, has certainly shown me that I have a lot that I'm not willing to change about myself. I'm working on it, but it's tough. And these things that I don't want to change about myself are part of my identity. And so when we think about ourselves, when I think about myself, I'm really thinking about the memories that I have of myself, the memories of my experiences, the identity that I've built up over the years that's obviously shared by the people around me who know me. But this identity is fairly consistent. When I wake up in the morning, people treat me more or less the same as they did yesterday. And it's this memory and this consistency that we're constantly placing on ourselves, on other people, and on the reality that provides a lot of the stability that we know. It would be very disconcerting if tomorrow morning I'd wake up and my wife didn't recognize me. It'd be something we'd have to talk about. But nevertheless, underneath all of this consistency in our memory that allows us to sort of shape and mold this into a recognizable, stable state, there is this underlying change that's going on all the time. And if we forget about that change, if we ignore it for too long, it very often can sneak up on us. And when we least expect it, suddenly change something. And this can be anything from, a physical injury or a change in someone around us that affects us. But whatever it is, even a global change that can lead to changes in the rules and regulations of our country, I think it really does help us to deal with it when we see this happening before. And this actually ties in a certain way to the first principle that I was talking about. When we're thinking about change and consistency, those also can be two identifiers of the micro and the macro, the patterns and the details. And when we think about change, change is really this very elusive thing that's going on, that's touching all these different areas in sometimes a seemingly unconnected way, but nevertheless, when you look for it, you can see how things were triggered by external events, butterfly effect and all that. And I think that it's this change that happens all around us all the time, this sort of motion of reality, this motion of the universe, that really is pushing things forward. And so when we recognize the changes, when we recognize the patterns, we're really looking beyond what we're experiencing right now, what we see around us right now, into something that's much higher and able to see much more. And I think that our ability to do that is very much helpful in allowing us to transition more easily in these sometimes, trying times of changes. And so, I mean, these are very, very large subjects, I think, but if I would be able to take them for a moment and bring it back to actual, practical permaculture, as it were, when we're talking about establishing a garden, for example, it's very easy, obviously, to just, focus on what plants I want to put or what water system I want to have or, what the details of the garden are that I'm most interested in. But it's very, very important to see how all of these different details work together, because they affect each other nonetheless. And so the two ways that we sort of do that is that over time, we're constantly checking and rechecking what the effect of those relationships are and how these things are affecting each other. And I think that when we do that over time, whether it's obviously in permaculture in our garden, whether it's in our personal lives, our interpersonal relationships, or whether it's on the Steam, the Steam blockchain and everything that's going on there, it really pays a lot to be able to take a moment, take a step back, and see how things are developing. And the changes that we implement are always going to be incremental. The larger changes that we make are usually a little bit more difficult to handle. I mean, in my personal life, I think whenever there's this sort of big decisive moment where I decide, okay, that's it, now I'm gonna, whatever it is, change something about myself, or, whether it's draw all my money out of Steemit or buy up the whatever. I'm not saying that that's always going to be a bad choice, but I think that often when we make those rash choices, we can make more mistakes. We're not reading the situation as carefully as we could be. And these are age-old, sayings we all know, but to take a moment and to breathe and to think about these things, to allow them to really sink in, often can allow us to think of creative, different solutions that we might not have been aware of before. And so I want to, I'll leave you with that just for now regarding the permaculture aspect of it. I can see that a lot has been going on in chat, not everything related specifically, so I'll try and just skim through a few of the questions. Someone asked, Makojan Tunem. I live in Portugal now. I am English. I'm actually from Israel. I grew up in Israel, and we moved to Portugal in order to start an eco-village based on cryptocurrency and natural giving. And as I explained at the beginning, the 5 methods that I mentioned. So before I leave you, there are sort of 2 buzzwords that I think have been going around the, at least in my sphere recently. And it seems that a lot of people are talking about it. Back in Israel, the COVID-19 virus has really taken hold. People are quarantined for 2 weeks. They've stopped flights from different countries. I mean, everyone I've spoken to is very much dealing with the virus. And I spoke about it very little, I think it was the last episode, and I won't go over it again, but I think that it's very easy to see that this seems to be very much a selected topic. I'm not even going to say that it's necessarily blown out of proportion, though I think it is, but it is definitely something that people are focusing on more than other subjects. And whenever that's the case, it seems to be that, regarding what we were talking about in the show, people are focusing on the details. People are focusing on the symptoms. People are focusing on the single cases and they're not actually addressing a larger problem. And I'll give an example with the coronavirus because that's what everyone back home is talking about. We had the avian flu. I think that was the first one before swine flu. Correct me if I'm wrong. But we had the bird flu, and everyone was sort of panicking and talking about what we're going to do and to try and find a vaccine and get this under control. And in the end, I don't know, as far as I experienced, it sort of fizzled out and nothing really happened. But afterwards, nobody spoke about dealing with viruses, pandemics. How do we make sure this won't happen again? What can we change in our behavior or our policies in order to prevent them? There's never this sort of follow-up from the symptoms to what was the problem that caused the symptoms. And whenever we don't do that, the symptoms are obviously going to return. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes they can actually return more aggressively. And so the next, I think, on the list in terms of the related viruses was the swine flu. And again, there was this huge uproar and people were very scared and everyone took it very seriously until they were sort of calmed by the authorities that it had passed and we're all okay. And then again, nothing else. And so we come to the coronavirus. And I don't know what will happen. I can't predict the future. But regardless of what will happen, my biggest fear is not what will end up with this virus, but what will actually be before the next virus. This is something that I always said, you know, I'm not worried about the attack that's coming now. I'm more worried about what the next attack is going to be. How can we predict that one before it happens? And so if we're talking about the coronavirus, I mean, specifically, I think for me personally, at least, it's very much a question of what we're dealing here. We're dealing with a virus which is attacking the body. And a lot of people seem to have forgotten that the body can do a lot of amazing things. And one of those is defend itself against viruses. In fact, on a daily basis, our body is killing off and defending against so many germs and viruses and bacteria and lots of different things that are getting into the system. And so there seems to be this sort of helplessness, this idea that anyone who will be infected is going to suddenly be succumbed by this, you know, nasty virus that actually has its own name, so it must be serious. We need to remember that after all, the body has an ability to defend against all kinds of different viruses. And what vaccines actually do is that they give the body the ability to develop antibodies. The vaccines don't actually protect the bodies themselves. The vaccines are those that teach the bodies how to protect itself. And bodies were protecting themselves long before vaccines were invented. I'm not going to talk pro or con vaccines right now because that's not the discussion at all. But exactly, potentially defend, absolutely. Everything I'm saying is not absolute, but there is the ability, there is the ability, the body does have a biological ability to be able to develop antibodies, to be able to fight off viruses. Now, that's the general idea. Specifically, the coronavirus is one specific virus that is obviously highly contagious and lots of people are, you know, getting it and some people are even dying from it. But there are also other viruses that are around in the world that we're not as worried about. And whenever we get to this point where we seem to be focusing so much on one specific thing, one specific part, I think it's a good point to take a step back and look at the larger picture and think about how we want to deal with it in general. So I'm not saying for or against anything. That's not my opinion. I'm just always proposing that we think about what we're doing. So I think I'm going to use the last 15 minutes of the show to just mention in very, very little. And I'm not going to get into a discussion because I honestly don't understand everything that's going on with the Steemit community. But I feel as a member and certainly as someone who is enjoying the benefits and who has obviously this show running on the blockchain, I feel it's my duty to at least mention what's going on with Steam and the drama that's been happening over the last few days. So I hope chat doesn't explode. But when I first saw, the posts and everything, and it took me a while to understand what was going on. I think, am I dropping frames? Sorry, hang on just 1 minute. Everything seems to be okay here. A little too close to the mic, sorry about that. Is that a bit better? How is the sound now? If there's any problem with the sounds, then please let me know. But when I was first reading about the bot, okay, I see. Okay, so there seem to be some technical problems with the bot. It's good because this isn't the important part of the show anyway, so you definitely don't need to be listening to this part. Okay, so I think on the stream you can still hear things okay, and the recording should be okay. So I'll just carry on with the little time that I have left. When I was reading about what was happening on Steam, it was obvious that it was a very big deal and everyone was talking about it, and it took me a while to sort of gather. But from what I saw, this decentralized system was, there was an attempted sort of hostile takeover, as it were. And there was this person, Justin, who was trying to sort of use his money to buy the blockchain, as it were, or a big part of the blockchain, and be able to take over it in that way. Now, I'm not going to talk about how we stop it, because all of the rest of it I really don't know about any of that. I would like to try and use what I've been talking about today, the actual permaculture principles, and apply that to the situation right now with the blockchain. And that is, we have this incredible idea of the Steam blockchain and everything that it represents and everything that's actually come out of it. And so before we go any further, I think it's very important to remember just how incredible this community and this idea is, going from a theoretical proposition, and I don't know too much about the people who ran it. I read very little about it, but having it come forward and bring so many people together and give so many people an opportunity to express themselves in so many ways is really something unique and something very, very impressive in and of itself, before we go any further. Now, the ideas that are proposed with Steam, and the idea of decentralization, etc., are very, very difficult ideas to implement, because there's very little infrastructure, there's very little history that we can draw upon to do it properly, basically. Obviously, there are cases, but when you relate it to, trying to do a centralized system, everyone is much more aware of what this means, and it's much easier to implement as a society is more geared towards it. But as soon as you wanted to start doing a decentralized system, you're starting to invent something pretty much from scratch. So the implementation of this so far, I think, has gone very well, and there have been some very big forks, some very big changes along the way. And I think, for me personally, I really don't know the ins and outs, but it seems to me that we do see this implementation of a very large community that is constantly checking and rechecking itself, and whether it's checking, each other or having other people come in and check, etc. There's lots of this feedback and accumulating information and statistics, and really trying to constantly improve this system. And I'm sure that's something that in a way happens to a certain extent in a lot of companies, though I'll be honest, you'd be surprised how many companies actually don't do that, or don't do that enough. But I think it's a very big part and big advantage that open source projects have, where anyone can come in, anyone can join, and anyone can voice whatever their thoughts are. And if they're, you know, completely off and have no idea what they're talking about, then there won't be any problem with that, and they won't be, you know, taken seriously by people who do understand. But if they do know something, and if they can actually give of themselves, then they'll have a place to do that. So having this open source environment, we can see just how robust and how complex and how interesting it has grown to be. And so now there's this sort of, it's almost a fairy tale, you know, almost Hollywood-like story of this big guy who looked really, you know, promised us the world and had all the money and was going to take us to the next level. And then at some point he turns around, and I'm obviously cartooning a little bit, but, you know, turns into this evil, you know, person who's trying to take over. Now, I'm sure that this isn't the case, but it does make it easier for me to tell the story this way, so just bear with me. But here's this person who is trying to change, as it were, a decentralized system into a system that he can purchase with his money. And so immediately, no matter what happens next, there is this reaction from the system. And I think that's a very amazing thing to see. It's very interesting. These changes seem to have happened very, very quickly and seem to have come rather out of nowhere, at least to me. But again, I wasn't very aware of what was happening around. And in response to that, since it seemed so, you know, such a large and scary change that's coming, there was a big, big reaction. And this reaction in and of itself can show what a system can be like, I think, when it's stable and robust. So I'm not saying necessarily what will happen, but without going any further, we can see that this group of people who I think are very, very different, and I think all have different things that they're trying to gain and, you know, feel differently about Steam and about what it should be. There is still this state, and I read this in a post, I can't remember actually who posted it, but it seems to have united everyone very much and coming together into, I don't care about, you know, what my disagreements with anyone else on the blockchain is right now. Right now, our, you know, ecosystem, our environment, our organism is quote unquote under attack. And in this case, everyone seems to have banded together and to have really taken it very seriously. I just compare it to other communities and other users, as it were, who I think very easily would say like, okay, you know, another startup that tried and didn't work, and, you know, it'll be bought out and we'll look for the next one, or, you know, I'll take my money now and try and cash out what I can. And that really doesn't seem to have happened. I don't know what will be over the next few days, but I first see people really rallying together and trying to come to defend what they feel is their, you know, home, their, you know, environment that they're there to protect. And I mean, first of all, it's very inspiring to see this going on, but I'd like to be able to learn from that to implement it in the ecoVillage model as well. And one day in the ecoVillage, where how do you, you know, band people together so that no matter the differences, no matter what people are, you know, experiencing or feeling independently, there is this very, very strong connection and understanding, an unspoken bond between everyone who is on the blockchain, that this is an idea that's worth fighting for. This is an idea that's worth protecting. Sure, it may not be perfect now, you know, there may be changes that need to come, and it certainly needs to be defended because of problems that it may have had. But nevertheless, as we're looking at these things happen, we can see that the Steemit community, the Steam community in general, is a very, very strong community when it, as it were, when it needs to be. And that robust system, that robust society where people feel so connected is really something that can defend against any kind of, you know, viruses that might attack. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment here to see if there's anything on chat that I missed. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions about anything I mentioned, not about Steam, no, I'm kidding. But if you do have any questions about anything that I've spoken about, you can type them up now because I can actually read. If I am not mistaken, Rondon, correct me, in a couple of hours, in 2 hours. Is there a show with the Crim? I'm not sure. I have to check the schedule. By the way, for all those who haven't seen the post and haven't seen the new website, the MSP Waves website has gone over a very big overhaul, and I have to say, really good. Congratulations, big congratulations to, I don't actually know who was in charge of that. Rondon, maybe you can type up, but amazing work. If you haven't checked it out, here I'll leave a link in the chat, and you can check out the schedule as well, which seems to be growing all the time. I remember that Rondon said that there's another town hall meeting tomorrow. At what time was that? I can't remember what you said. Yeah, so if you want to check out any of the other shows, I can see lots of new people who are in the chat for this now. So welcome to the MSP Waves. I'm Olev. I think someone was asking before if for my handle, my Steam name is also Olev. Let's have a look and see. Yes. So yes, if you want to check out the schedule, there have been lots of new DJs who've been joining MSP Waves, and I I really don't know what will happen, but I'd personally be very upset if anything happened to the blockchain that changed it and that wouldn't allow me to continue broadcasting. It's been a really amazing experience for me to join this family, this community, to be welcomed in. So thank you very, very much for welcoming me, one and all, here. Okay, so 2 hours until Crimson Clad's Full Force Radio, which is metal music, right? And she talks throughout. She's great. I haven't listened to all of her shows, but the ones that I have, I've really enjoyed. So go check her out in a couple of hours. Heretic Kitten asks, I'd like to hear more about micro, macro, and middle concepts. How do you think size affects our perception? Rich, poor, community, individual, etc. Wow. Okay, that is an excellent question. Unfortunately, I have about a minute and a half, so I don't think I can cram the entire answer. But Heretic Kitten, if you are here next week, I will make sure to address that question in the beginning of the show. I'll give it like the first 10 minutes to talk about it a little bit and finish up what we talked about today. Sorry. So yes, I apologize. And Ura Soul, I saw them before, is the mastermind behind making the site happen. So thank you so much for that, Ura Soul. Amazing work. Town hall meeting tomorrow between 12 and 1 p.m. Eastern European, UTC. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for joining. I've been Olev. This has been the Discomfort Zone podcast, and I'll see you all next week.